The fields south of Brussels lay shrouded in the morning mist of June 18, 1815, a grey veil that would soon lift to reveal one of history's most decisive battlefields. Upon the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, the Duke of Wellington had arrayed his polyglot army, British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops standing shoulder to shoulder in a defensive line that stretched across the muddy landscape. Below them, in the valley that would forever bear the name Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte marshalled his forces for what would prove to be his final gamble. His last attempt to reclaim the empire that had slipped through his fingers on the frozen plains of Russia and in the streets of Leipzig. But this is not merely the story of emperors and dukes, of grand strategy and sweeping maneuvers across the Belgian countryside. This is the story of the old guard, Napoleon's most elite corps, the men who had followed their emperor from the sands of Egypt to the frozen Berzina, who had stood unbroken at Austerlitz and Jena, who embodied the very spirit of La Grande Armée itself. These were the grognards, the grumblers, veterans of 20 years of continental warfare, men whose weathered faces told stories of victories won and empires forged. They had never broken, never fled, never surrendered, until this day, when the fields of Waterloo would demand from them the ultimate sacrifice. When their emperor would call upon them one final time to break the Anglo-Allied line and secure his throne. Or die in the attempt. The road to this desperate final confrontation had been paved with Napoleon's audacious return from exile on Elba. In March of 1815, he had landed on the French coast with barely 1,000 men, yet within 20 days he had reclaimed Paris without firing a shot. As regiment after regiment sent to rest him instead rallied to his tricolour standards. The restored Bourbon King Louis XVIII had fled, and Napoleon once again sat upon the throne of France. But Europe would not permit his return. The great powers Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia declared him an outlaw and mobilized their West armies. Napoleon's only hope lay in striking swiftly, in defeating his enemies piecemeal before they could concentrate their overwhelming numbers against him. He had chosen to strike north into Belgium, to drive a wedge between the British army under Wellington and the Prussian forces commanded by Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. At Ligny, 2 days prior to Waterloo, Napoleon had achieved what seemed to be a decisive victory over the Prussians, mauling Blücher's army and sending it reeling eastward. The old Prussian field marshal himself had been unhorsed and trampled by French cavalry, lying beneath a dead horse for hours as the battle raged round him. Napoleon believed the Prussians to be broken, retreating toward their supply lines in Germany, no longer a factor in the campaign. This miscalculation would prove fatal, for Blücher, bruised, battered, but unbroken, had instead ordered his forces to march west, toward the sound of the guns at Waterloo, to stand by his British allies. Wellington, for his part, had taken up position on the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean after fighting a delaying action at Quatrebrus. The Anglo-Dutch-German army numbered approximately 68,000 men, deployed in a defensive posture that utilized the reverse slope tactics Wellington had perfected in the Peninsular War. His men would wait behind the crest of the ridge, sheltered from French artillery fire, emerging only when the French columns approached. The strong points of Hougoumont Chateau on the western flank and La Haye-Saint farmhouse in the center would anchor his line, forcing the French to expend precious time and manpower in attempts to capture them. Napoleon surveyed the field from the ridge of La Belle Alliance, his telescope sweeping across Wellington's positions. He commanded approximately 72,000 men, veterans mostly, though not all possessed the quality of his beloved Imperial Guard. His artillery numbered 250 guns, a formidable concentration of firepower that he intended to use to pound Wellington's ridge into submission before launching his infantry assaults. Yet the emperor was not well. Hemorrhoids plagued him, forcing him to remain in his carriage for much of the early morning. More critically, his legendary decisiveness seemed to have deserted him. He delayed the start of the battle until nearly 11:30, waiting for the waterlogged ground to dry sufficiently for his artillery to maneuver effectively. This delay would prove catastrophic, giving Blücher precious hours to march his Prussians closer to the battlefield. When the French guns finally opened fire, their roar was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that could be heard in Brussels. Iron shot and explosive shells asked across the valley, plunging into the Anglo-Allied positions. But Wellington's reverse slope tactics mitigated much of this bombardment. The French gunners, unable to observe where their shots fell, were firing at estimates, and much of their ammunition buried itself harmlessly in the soft earth or sailed over the ridge entirely. Still, where the shot found its mark, the results were terrible. Men were torn apart by the iron balls, limbs severed, bodies eviscerated. The distinctive crash of artillery fire, the screams of wounded horses, and the shouted orders of officers trying to maintain cohesion created a hellish symphony that would continue throughout the day. The first major assault of the day came not against the main ridge, but against the chateau of Hougoumont on Wellington's right flank. Prince Jérôme Bonaparte, Napoleon's youngest brother, hurled his division against the stout walls and gates of this fortified manor house, held by companies of British Guards. What was intended as a diversionary attack instead became an all-consuming vortex that drew in more and more French troops throughout the day. The fighting among the orchards, formal gardens, and outbuildings of Hougoumont was savage and intimate. Musket fire at point-blank range, bayonet charges through smoke-filled courtyards. Desperate hand-to-hand struggles over walls and through windows. At one point, French infantry succeeded in breaking through the north gate, pouring into the courtyard where they threatened to overwhelm the defenders. But a handful of British guardsmen, including the massive Corporal James Graham and Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonald, physically threw themselves against the heavy wooden gates, pushing them closed against the press of French soldiers and securing them with a massive wooden bar. This act, which Wellington would later describe as the action that won the battle, sealed the fate of those French soldiers who had entered the courtyard. They were cut down to a man. While Hougoumont burned and bled, the main French assault was developing against Wellington's centre-left. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, had been given command of the battle while Napoleon positioned himself at the rear, and Ney prepared to send d'Erlon escorts for divisions numbering nearly 20,000 men in a massive attack against the Anglo-Allied line. These were not raw conscripts, but veterans of the Spanish campaigns, men who had fought Wellington's army before. They advanced in an unusual formation, deploying in columns of battalions that created dense masses of humanity, each column presenting a frontage of perhaps 200 men and a depth of 24 ranks. The drums beat the pas de charge, that distinctive rhythm that had preceded French victories across Europe, and the great columns surged forward, their bayonets catching the afternoon sun. Their voices raised in shouts of Vive l'Empereur. The British infantry received them with a discipline born of years of professional soldiering. Deployed in the two-deep firing line that had become their trademark, the redcoats held their fire until the French were at murderously close range, then unleashed devastating volleys that tore into the heads of the French columns. The mathematics of firepower favored the line over the column, where a French column could bring perhaps 200 muskets to bear on its frontage. A British battalion in line could deploy nearly 800. The effect was predictable and terrible. The French columns staggered under the weight of fire, men falling in heaps, the formations beginning to lose cohesion. Yet still they pressed forward, brave men advancing into a storm of lead, officers waving their swords, sergeants pushing the ranks forward with their halberds. Into this maelstrom rode the British heavy cavalry, the Household and Union Brigades, some 2,000 mounted men on massive horses, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. They had been waiting behind the ridge, and now they swept forward at the trot, then the canter, finally launching into a full gallop as they crested the ridge and saw the disordered French columns beef. For them, the impact was devastating. The French infantry, already shaken by the musketry, broke before this avalanche of horseflesh and steel. The cavalry rode through them and over them, sabres rising and falling, men screaming and dying beneath the flashing hoofs. The French artillery crews, seeing the cavalry bearing down upon them, attempted to flee but were overtaken and cut down at their guns. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed as though Wellington's cavalry had won the battle single-handedly. But cavalry, once launched, is difficult to recall, and the blood was up among the British horsemen. Instead of rallying behind their own lines, they continued their charge across the valley, up the opposite slope, toward the French main positions. There they encountered fresh French cavalry cuirassiers in their gleaming steel breastplates and lancers with their deadly lances and the tables turned with brutal efficiency. The British horses were blown, exhausted from their charge uphill through mud. The French cavalry fell upon them and destroyed them, cutting down men and horses alike. Of the 2,000 British heavy cavalry who had charged so magnificently, barely half returned. They had broken Delann's assault and captured to French eagles, regimental standards whose loss was a terrible disgrace. But the price had been catastrophically high, and Wellington would sorely miss those horsemen in the hours to come. It was now past 3 in the afternoon, and Marshal Ney, watching the chaos in the valley and misinterpreting movement in the Anglo-Allied lines as the beginning of a retreat, made a decision that would become legendary for its catastrophic consequences. He ordered a massive cavalry assault against Wellington's unbroken infantry squares. This was a fundamental violation of military doctrine. Cavalry alone could not break properly formed infantry squares, not without artillery and infantry support to disorder them first. But Ney, whose courage had never been questioned, but whose judgment had often been suspect, was determined to break Wellington's line before the day ended. He gathered every available cavalry regiment, cuirassiers, lancers, chasseurs, carabiniers, forming a mass of nearly 5,000 mounted men. The largest cavalry force assembled on a European battlefield in a generation. They advanced in waves, a magnificent and terrible sight, the ground shaking beneath tens of thousands of hooves, plumes streaming from helmets, armor gleaming, swords raised. They swept up the slope and crashed against Wellington's infantry squares like waves against rocks. The Anglo-Allied infantry, formed in squares of 4 ranks deep, presented a bristling wall of bayonets on every face. When the cavalry came within range, they unleashed controlled volleys that emptied saddles and brought horses crashing down. The cavalry swirled round the squares, trying to find a weak point, a gap, anything that might allow them to penetrate the formation. They found none. The British infantry stood firm, their officers walking calmly behind the ranks, calling out words of encouragement, stepping over the bodies of the fallen to maintain the integrity of the formation. For nearly 2 hours, this insane spectacle continued. The French cavalry would pull back to reorganize, then charge again, and again, and again. They achieved nothing except their own destruction. Horses and men fell in heaps round the British squares. The ground became carpeted with French dead and dying, and still Ney ordered his cavalry forward. Wellington, observing this suicidal commitment of French cavalry without infantry or artillery support, is said to have remarked simply, "Damn the fellow, though whether he meant Nee's courage or his stupidity remains ambiguous. The French cavalry charges finally petered out as the exhausted survivors, their horses blown and their numbers decimated, withdrew to their own lines. They had accomplished nothing except to remove from Napoleon's order of battle the very cavalry he would desperately need in the battle's final hours. While the great cavalry drama unfolded on the ridge, a quieter but equally desperate struggle was taking place at La Haye-Sainte, the fortified farmhouse in the centre of Wellington's line. This position was held by the King's German Legion, a unit of Hanoverian exiles who had fled German states occupied by Napoleon and entered British service. They were professionals of the highest order, and they defended La Haye-Sainte with a tenacity that bordered on the superhuman. Throughout the afternoon, French infantry assaulted the farm complex, fighting through the outbuildings, over the walls, through the barn and main house. The Germans held them, but their ammunition was running low. Desperate messages were sent to Wellington's headquarters requesting resupply, but through a series of miscommunications and the chaos of battle, no ammunition arrived. Finally, as the late afternoon shadows lengthened, the Germans exhausted their last cartridges. When the French came again, they could not be stopped. La Haye-Sainte fell, and the French poured through this gap in Wellington's centre, bringing up artillery to within 70 yards of the main ridge and beginning to pound the British line at point blank. K-range. It was now approaching 7 o'clock in the evening, and Wellington's situation was becoming critical. His centre had been weakened by the loss of La Haye-Sainte. His cavalry had been largely expended, and his infantry had stood for hours under artillery bombardment and repeated assaults. Casualties were mounting, gaps were appearing in his line. But to the east, the sound of heavy firing announced the arrival of the Prussians. Blucher had kept his word. His troops, after an exhausting march through muddy roads, were beginning to arrive on Napoleon's right flank. French reserves were hastily redirected to meet this new threat, troops that Napoleon had intended to use in a final assault against Wellington's battered line. Napoleon stood at his command post at La Belle Alliance, watching his empire slip away. The Prussian attack was gaining strength, threatening to envelop his entire right flank. Wellington's line, though battered, had not broken. The day was fading, and with it his final chance to reclaim his throne. In such a moment, lesser men might have accepted defeat and ordered a retreat. But Napoleon Bonaparte had never been a man who accepted defeat easily. He had one final card to play, one last reserve that had never failed him, one cause that had never known defeat. He would unleash the old guard. The Imperial Guard had been formed in 1804, during the early years of Napoleon's empire, as an elite corps personally attached to the emperor. Over the years, it had grown into a miniature army within the army, complete with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. But the heart of the Guard, its soul and its pride, was the middle and old Guard infantry veteran grenadiers and chasseurs who had served for years, many for more than a decade. To be admitted to the Guard was the highest honor a French soldier could aspire to. These men received higher pay, better rations, superior equipment, and the right to wear the distinctive buckskin caps that marked them as the emperor's chosen. They marched with a swagger that proclaimed their elite status, and they had never, in all their battles across Europe, been broken by enemy action. As the drums began to beat the assembly, the battalions of the Guard formed up near La Belle Alliance. There were 9 battalions available, 2 of grenadiers and 2 of chasseurs from the Old Guard, the most veteran units, along with 5 battalions from the Middle Guard. Each battalion numbered between 400 and 600 men, making this assault force approximately 5,000 strong. They formed in their traditional columns, officers taking their places at the front and flanks, drummers beating the measured cadence that would accompany their advance. Napoleon himself rode among them, his presence electrifying the ranks. "The Guard will advance," he ordered, and a roar went up from the grizzled veterans, a shout of "Vive l'Empereur!" That was heard across the battlefield, but Napoleon did not accompany them up the slope. Whether from illness, exhaustion, or a dawning recognition that this might be his final throw of the dice, the Emperor remained at La Belle Alliance, watching through his telescope as his finest troops marched toward their destiny. Marshal Ney, miraculously still alive despite having had 5 horses shot from under him during the day, took command of the assault. The Guard would advance in a rough column formation, slightly refuse that is, advancing at an angle to the British line with the intention of striking Wellington centre-right, an area that French intelligence suggested had been weakened by the day's fighting. They advanced at the measured pace of 75 steps per minute, a walk rather than a charge, maintaining their formation with parade ground precision despite the mud that sucked at their boots and the bodies they had to step over or round. French artillery moved forward after the capture of La Haye-Sainte, opened fire to support the advance, shells screaming overhead to crash into the British positions. From the British perspective, watching this advance must have been a moment of supreme psychological pressure. The Imperial Guard's reputation preceded them. Every soldier on that ridge knew they were watching the approach of troops who had never been defeated, the finest infantry in Europe, perhaps in the world. The setting sun behind the Guard gave them an almost supernatural appearance, dark silhouettes advancing through the smoke and gathering dusk. Preceded by the sound of their drums and the measured tread of thousands of boots, Wellington, observing this development, moved personally to the threatened sector. He had already identified which units would receive the Guards, assault the British 1st Foot Guards on his right centre, supported by other infantry brigades. These were veteran troops, professionals who had fought in the peninsula and elsewhere, but they had never faced the Imperial Guard. Wellington rode among them, his presence a calming influence, ensuring they were properly deployed and ready. He ordered them to lie down in the positions behind the crest of the ridge, sheltering them from the French artillery fire and concealing their numbers from the approaching Guard. As the Guard columns approached the crest, they faced a final obstacle, a sunken lane that ran along the ridge at that point. The leading ranks navigated this depression, clambering up the far side, reforming their ranks and continuing their advance. They were now perhaps 50 yards from the crest, close enough that they could make out individual faces among any troops opposing them, though all they could see was the ridge itself and the smoke that hung over everything. The drummers increased their tempo slightly, and the Guard prepared for the final rush that would carry them over the crest and into the British positions. At this moment, Wellington gave the command that would echo through history. "Now, Maitland, now's your time." The 1st Foot Guards, who had been lying down in full ranks behind the crest, rose to their feet in a single fluid motion, presenting a wall of red coats and levelled muskets that appeared as if by magic before the stunned French. The range was perhaps 30 yards, point-blank from military muskets fire. The volley crashed out, over 1,000 muskets discharging simultaneously, the sound like the crack of doom. The head of the French column simply disintegrated. Men fell in heaps, officers were blown backwards, the entire front ranks of the Guard column collapsed into a writhing mass of dead and wounded. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard recoiled. The shock of that devastating volley, the sudden appearance of enemy forces where none had been expected, the horrific casualties among their leading ranks, it was too much, even for these veterans. The column staggered, lost its forward momentum, began to show gaps in its formation. The British Guards, following their doctrine, fixed bayonets and charged while the French were still disordered. It was brutal, Savage work with steel and musket butt, officers stabbing with their swords, men grappling hand to hand in the smoke. The French, their formation broken, their casualties mounting, began to fall back. To the left of the main guard column, another battalion of the middle guard, some accounts suggest these were the 4th Chasseurs, had advanced slightly ahead of the main body and reached the crest near Th. E position held by British General Sir Colin Halkett's brigade and elements of Dutch Belgian infantry. Here too, the guard was received with devastating close-range volleys. Sir Colin Halkett himself was severely wounded, but his troops stood firm. The 52nd Light Infantry, one of the finest regiments in the British Army, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Sir John Colborne, executed a brilliant tactical maneuver. Observing that the French Guard column was exposed on its flank, Colborne wheeled his regiment 90 degrees without orders from higher command and marched them directly across the French flank. Then delivered a series of crushing volleys into the Guards' unprotected side. No formation, no matter how elite, can sustain such punishment. The Guard column broke and began to retreat. The cry went up across the battlefield, "La Garde recule." The Guard retreats. For French soldiers who had been taught from their first day of service that the Guard never retreated, never broke, this was psychological shock of the first order. If the Imperial Guard could be broken, what hope did the rest of the army have? The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. French units that had stood firm throughout the day's fighting suddenly began to waver. Officers tried desperately to maintain order, but panic is contagious, and once it begins in an army, it spreads like wildfire. Wellington, sensing the critical moment, rode to the crest of the ridge and waved his hat in the air, the signal for a general advance. The entire Anglo-Allied line, which had stood on the defensive for 9 hours, surged forward with a roar. They crashed into the retreating French with the momentum of men who know the battle is won and they need only complete the victory. The French army, exhausted, demoralized by the repulse of the Guard, and now pressed on their right flank by increasing numbers of Prussians, began to dissolve. What had been an army became a mob, units breaking and streaming to the rear, abandoning their artillery, throwing down their muskets, thinking only of escape. In the chaos of the French collapse, the battalions of the Old Guard, those 2 battalions of grenadiers and 2 of chasseurs who formed the corps of the Guard, the most veteran units, did not break. While the rest of the French army fled in disorder, these 400- or 500-man battalions formed squares and began a fighting withdrawal. They moved slowly across the darkening battlefield, stopping periodically to deliver volleys at pursuing British and Prussian troops, maintaining their formation with a discipline that was almost supernatural given the circumstances. Allied cavalry swirled round them, artillery pounded them, but they did not break. As the Old Guard squares retreated through the village of Plansenut, already in Prussian hands, General Pierre Cambron commanded the 1st Chasseurs of the Guard. British accounts claim that when called upon to surrender, he replied with a single word that cannot be printed in polite company: "Murd." Though French accounts have him saying the Guard dies but does not surrender. The truth is likely lost in the smoke and confusion of that terrible evening, but the sentiment is clear enough. These men had followed Napoleon from triumph to triumph, had stood by him in defeat, and they would die rather than surrender. They nearly did die, all of them. The Old Guard squares were gradually whittled down by artillery fire and musketry, their numbers shrinking with each passing minute. General Michel, commanding one of the squares, fell wounded. Cambron himself was wounded and captured, along with hundreds of his men. Some accounts suggest that Napoleon briefly took shelter within one of these squares during the retreat, protected by his faithful God even as his empire crumbled round him. Whether true or not, the image is powerful, the emperor in the center of a square of dying men, making his way through the wreckage of his final army. As night fell on the battlefield, the pursuit continued by moonlight. The Prussians, less exhausted than Wellington's troops who had borne the brunt of the day's fighting, led the chase, hunting the broken French army through the darkness. The roads south toward France became choked with abandoned artillery, overturned wagons, discarded equipment, and the bodies of men who had fallen during the retreat or been cut down by Prussian cavalry. Napoleon himself narrowly escaped capture, abandoning his carriage and its contents, including the elaborate toilet kit and correspondence that would later be seized by the Prussians, and riding hard for France with a small escort. The battlefield itself was a vision of hell. Perhaps 50,000 men lay dead or wounded in an area of less than 3 square miles, carpeting the ground so thickly in places that it was difficult to walk without stepping on bodies. The wounded cried out for water, for help, for death to end their suffering. The dead lay in the positions where they had fallen, British squares with French cavalry and infantry piled round them like driftwood after a flood, the approaches to Hougoumont littered with bodies in French uniforms, the ground round La Haye Saint dark with blood. The old guard had left its final traces in the scattered bodies of grenadiers still clutching their muskets, men who had died where they stood, maintaining their formation to the end. In the days following the battle, the dead were buried in mass graves, though not before the local peasantry and professional looters had stripped the corpses of anything valuable: uniforms, boots, weapons, even teeth, which would be sold to dentists as Waterloo teeth from making dentures. The wounded who survived the battlefield would face primitive medical treatment, amputation without anesthesia, and the ever-present risk of infection. Many who had survived the battle itself would die in the days and weeks that followed from their wounds. Napoleon reached Paris on June 21st, 3 days after the battle. He found the political situation impossible. The legislature demanded his abdication, and even his most loyal supporters recognized that his cause was lost. On June 22nd, he abdicated for the 2nd time, naming his young son as Napoleon II, though this was a fiction that no one took seriously. He briefly considered attempting to reach America, to begin a new life in the New World, but British naval patrols made this impossible. On July 15th, he surrendered to the British, hoping for honorable treatment as a prisoner of war. Instead, he would be exiled to St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the remaining 6 years of his life writing his memoirs and refighting his battles in woods, dying in 1821 at the age of 51. The Imperial Guard officially ceased to exist in the weeks following Waterloo. The surviving members were disbanded, their eagles taken, their proud traditions ended. Some went into exile with Napoleon, following him to St. Helena. Others melted back into civilian life, becoming farmers, shopkeepers, veterans who would gather in taverns to tell increasingly embellished stories of their service. A few would serve again when Napoleon's nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, became Emperor Napoleon III in 1852, though by then they were old men, living relics of a vanished age. The impact of Waterloo reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Napoleon's defeat ended the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars that had convulsed Europe for more than 2 decades, bringing relative peace to the continent for nearly a century. The Congress of Vienna's territorial settlements would establish a balance of power that, while imperfect, prevented major European war until 1914. France, though defeated, remained a great power, but would never again under Napoleon dominate the continent as it had between 1804 and 1814. Britain emerged as the world's preeminent power, a position it would hold throughout the 19th century. Prussia's role in the victory enhanced its prestige among the German states, setting the stage for German unification later in the century. But on that field south of Brussels, in the gathering darkness of June 1815, as the Old Guard made its last stand and then retreated in good order while the rest of the French army dissolved into panic, none of these long-term consequences were visible. There was only the immediate reality of defeat, of an army broken, of an empire ended. The Guard had done what had been asked of them. They had advanced against Wellington's line with the courage and discipline that had made them legendary. But courage and discipline, for once, had not been enough. They had met an enemy who would not break, who matched their determination with equal resolve, and who had the advantage of position and preparation. The Guard had faced their final test, and though individual acts of heroism were innumerable, though they maintained their cohesion and honor even in defeat, they had failed to break Wellington's line. That failure ended an empire and changed the course of European history. The legacy of the Old Guard's last stand at Waterloo extends beyond mere military history. They became, in death and defeat, symbols of unwavering loyalty and courage in the face of hopeless odds. Victor Hugo would immortalize them in Les Miserables, describing their square at Waterloo surrounded by enemies and dying by inches, refusing to surrender. Artists would paint them in their final moments, standing firm while the rest of the army fled. Their story would inspire military units for generations, becoming the gold standard against which elite troops measured themselves. Even Wellington, no friend to Napoleon or France, paid tribute to their courage, remarking that he had never seen anything like the Guard's final advance, a testament to their training and determination. Yet we must also recognize the tragedy inherent in their story. These were men who had given years of their lives to Napoleon's ambitions, who had marched across Europe fighting wars of conquest dressed up as wars of liberation, who had enforced the will of one man's empire across an entire continent. They were magnificent soldiers, but they served a cause that was, ultimately, built on sand, dependent on continued military victory to sustain itself. When that string of victories ended, as all such strings must eventually end, the entire edifice collapsed, and they collapsed with it. Their loyalty and courage were admirable in the abstract, but in service to what? An emperor who had brought death and destruction to millions, who had subordinated entire nations to his will, whose continental system had impoverished half of Europe for the sake of his rivalry with Britain. The fields of Waterloo today are peaceful, marked by monuments and memorials. The Lion's Mound, built by the Dutch on the spot where the Prince of Orange was wounded, towers over the battlefield, visible for miles round. The restored Hougoumont stands as a museum, its walls still bearing the scars of musket balls and artillery shot. La Haye Saint has been rebuilt, looking much as it did on that fateful day. Visitors walk the ridge where Wellington's army stood, imagining the sight of the Imperial Guard advancing through the smoke, hearing in their mind's ear the drums and the shouts, the crash of volleys and the clash of steel. It requires considerable imagination to populate these peaceful fields with the chaos and carnage of battle, to understand the scale of violence that occurred here in the space of a single afternoon and evening. For the Old Guard, Waterloo was their Thermopylae, their final stand against overwhelming odds. But unlike the Spartans at Thermopylae, whose defeat became a moral victory that inspired Greece to eventual triumph over Persia, the Guard's defeat at Waterloo was simply defeat, the end of a story rather than the beginning of one. They fought magnificently and lost utterly. Their eagles were captured, their formations broken, their empire ended. But they maintained their honor to the end, and in doing so, they earned a permanent place in military history as symbols of elite troops pushed beyond their breaking point and discovering, too late, that even the finest soldiers have limits, that even the most storied units can be defeated when the circumstances are sufficiently adverse. As the sun set on June 18, 1815, it set not only on the battlefield of Waterloo, but on an entire era of European history. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic period, with all its tumult and transformation, its promise and its terror, had come to an end. The old guard, marching back through the darkness in their battered squares, carried with them the fading dreams of French imperium, of a Europe united under Napoleon's rule, of glory won at the point of a bayonet. They had given everything for their emperor, and he had spent them like corns, using them in a final desperate gamble that failed. Such is the fate of soldiers in the service of empires built on conquest, no matter how elite, no matter how brave, no matter how loyal. They are ultimately expendable, tools to be used and discarded when they can no longer deliver victory. The old guard learned this truth in the mud and smoke of Waterloo, learned it with their lives, and left behind a legend that would outlive the empire they served and the emperor they followed into the darkness of defeat,